So I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight. He has done several talks for us over the past few years, along with our parent information series. Alan is a licensed psychologist with the Children's Program in Southwest Portland. He's been doing this work for over 20 years. He works with tweens, teens, families, and adults. So basically everyone. And his focus is on building skills to better manage mood and anxiety. So thank you for being here, Alan.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Yeah, I'm glad to be with you all tonight. Looking forward to hopefully what feels like a conversation. So just echoing what you already heard, I definitely welcome comments, questions as we get rolling together tonight. I'll be going through a PowerPoint presentation, as I'm sure you've seen many of these kinds of presentations, but we'll do my best to try and have this be a little bit more engaging. I'll be throwing some questions out periodically. I'd really warmly invite people to respond to, either verbally or in chat. And then, as was already said, we'll save some time at the end for just kind of more individualized questions as we stop the recording part. So I was reflecting a little bit on the topic, and it was sort of funny. I was thinking, wait, are we post-pandemic? I think we are, but in many ways, part of why I was interested in this is I know that we in many ways are still experiencing aftershocks or after effects of really what we've collectively been through. And I don't think it would be an exaggeration to refer to the COVID-19 pandemic as something that's been traumatic, whether it's trauma with a big T or a little t. I'll leave it for each of you to sort of consider for yourselves, but it's definitely had a major reorganizing impact on individuals and families. So I thought it might be useful for us to start off by reviewing a little bit about, what was it that happened? What do we understand about it? What are some of the impacts that are known? Are there some questions we still don't have answers to? And then try to fold that into some practical tips and ideas that you can hopefully take home with you and apply in the coming days and weeks. I'll go ahead and get this going here. Okay, so you can see the title of the talk here. Just on a personal note, I am also a parent, and in my family, I have two kids, and one kid was a senior in high school, so did the so-called drive-through graduation. I don't know if any of you went to any of those, but instead of sitting through a formal graduation, it was you get in the car, drive past the front of the high school, get out real quick, grab your diploma, get in the car, and leave. So that was our 12th grader, and then my other kid was a 9th grader when the pandemic hit. So, I suspect that many or most of you may have younger kids, but, depending on where we were in our own family development, I think we experienced this in different ways. Let's talk about our aims. So as I mentioned, we would like to just review, what do we understand? What are the findings about impact of the pandemic based on just kind of a quick review of the research and coverage out there? I'd like to offer some ideas around core principles that I think can be useful as we think about ways to guide and support our kids' well-being. As I mentioned, I want to give you some very specific ideas, things that maybe feel actionable or applicable to day-to-day parenting. And then, as we said, we will save time for questions. So hopefully that sounds okay. I'd like to start with a bit of self-reflection here. Why might we want to revisit something that many of us would really, in fact, prefer to forget, right? Well, in work with people who've experienced difficult events or traumas, one idea that we often talk about is this sort of name it to tame it approach. And basically this means that the things that we can talk about and identify and really understand better tend to be easier to process and heal and recover from. Certainly not everyone was affected the same way. For some people, I've even talked to some of them who said, actually, it's kind of great when we were sort of in lockdown. That was really a positive time for me as an adult or or us as a family. And other people, really had a pretty difficult time. I just want to honor and respect that there are going to be a lot of variations in how you and your kid and your family might have experienced the pandemic. And obviously there's room for that variation as we talk about this tonight. But we can tell from the research and just some findings as we work with families now, that there are some themes that carry forward through many families. So if you'd be willing, I'd love it if people would just put out there, maybe in the chat, or if you want to unmute, what is a hard thing or one of the hardest things that you experienced or you think your kid experienced as far as the intense time of the pandemic? Give people a minute to consider that, and feel free to share if you'd be willing. As I already kind of said in my own circumstance, well, I'll kind of name two. One was sort of needing to let go of expectations about how this particular time of parenting would go. So, thinking about having a great senior year and finishing strong, really needed to let that go because that was not really the experience that my kid had. For those of us who were in the workplace, many of us had to have a pretty significant reorganization. I can say here at Children's Program, we learned in a hurry how to switch to doing therapy and clinical services via telehealth remotely. So that was a pretty big change. Okay, I've got the chat.
Comments in chat. Oh, can you see the chat?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I opened that up. So I see one person said lack of ability to play with friends. Yep, your kids were younger at the time. And loneliness. Yep. And just as an educator, like many others, yep, how you did your job changed and lost family. Yep, due to a COVID death. Right. Yep, I'm really sorry to hear that. Yep. This online versus in person, huge change, and we'll talk about that more tonight. Yeah. This may be okay, my son still defaults to screens for a sense of connection. Yep, since that's the only way he could play with friends, for sure. Yeah, just the hours a day that all of us, but especially the kids, both for their education, and then that became the opportunity for socialization. Yeah, I knew a number of folks, some colleagues here at work were pregnant during the pandemic, and just the stress of that and trying to stay healthy and feeling isolated, and having another kid already. Yeah. Thanks for sharing these comments. Feel free to if you want. I mean, it is possible that even amongst the challenges, there might have been maybe some silver linings or some positive impacts. Does anyone want to share something along those lines? Anything that's actually kind of felt like it was positive or pleasant during this time? I don't know if it was positive for them, but I think I spent a lot more time with my teenagers than I probably would have otherwise. They were around quite a bit more, so that was positive for us. Just arrived in the US and your son had trouble learning English and school and learning problems. Sure, yeah. Okay, so not having to drive everywhere, I'm guessing that's a positive. Once we felt safe, our neighbors connected in outdoor hangouts. Yep. Family walks during the day, played together more at parks. Yeah. Family time, partner got to be more involved with the kid in pregnancy. Wonderful. Yeah. Yeah, any others? Socialization problems, yeah, for you too, as parents, yeah. And the reality too is that it's not either or, right? I mean, it's not either the pandemic was a great experience or was a terrible experience. That there, is very likely a mixture in many of our families. Yeah. Okay. I'd like us actually to take a look, and I think I may have to pop out for a second of the, oh no, let's see. Yeah, okay, I think I'm gonna have to turn off the presentation just for a sec to get to this quick poll that we're gonna do here. Okay. So hopefully folks are having this pop up on their screens. And if you would, please do take a minute to answer these 4 questions. And just out of curiosity, kind of get another sense of impacts and effects for folks. Okay, great. See people responding. Thanks for that. Great, great. Give people just maybe just another few moments here. Okay, I think everyone's participated. Thank you, thank you. All right. I'm going to go ahead and end this and we'll take a look at the results all together. All right, so how much did the COVID-19 pandemic change my child's life? For one of you, really hardly at all. For the majority of you, either at least a bit or a great deal. Yep, okay. How about this? My child, my family was negatively impacted by the pandemic. Neutral to pretty much agree with that. Okay. My child, my family is still feeling the impacts of the pandemic. Okay, so most people say, yeah, there are some ways, and I invite us to consider that together as we go on. And then finally, 1 to 10 scale, my child, my family has recovered from the impacts of the pandemic. And looks like many people, that's funny, I forgot how I scaled this. I think I think we scaled this higher means yes, you tend to agree that there's been more recovery. Yeah, okay. And certainly I hope that tonight's talk is going to maybe be a little bit of a contribution towards that recovery piece, or at least some other perspectives that could be useful. Great. Okay, thanks for doing that, everyone. Okay. All right, so let's move on. So as a framing idea, I'd like to offer this idea that child development is complicated, as we parents know. There's really multiple systems kind of nested within each other as far as factors that impact and influence child development. And so folks may be familiar with this idea that a psychologist named Yuri Bronfenbrenner proposed an ecological systems model. And I'll just kind of walk you through this here. So the child in the center, the individual, is primarily and most proximally influenced by, the family, other factors in their daily life, school, neighbors, friends. If you're an adult and you're this individual in the center, that you may also be influenced by work. As we move outward from that kind of inner circle of influence, we have other things like parents and friends, an extended family, media, government. Beyond that is what Bronfenbrenner would call the macro system, things like the economic system in which we exist, or the culture in which we exist, political systems, social norms. And then this outer ring just acknowledges that, and all of this is evolving and changing over time, what could be referred to as the chronosystem. Okay. So the idea here is that there's, multiple influences, and just the obvious point I want to offer here is that the pandemic really kind of influenced all of those systems, right? If you really look at that, certainly the political system, the economic system, governments locally, and then right, school, work, the whole ball of wax. So just some visuals to kind of orient us a little bit more. So, we watched this, crisis unfold and kind of fan out across the whole world. So, starting with, kind of closely tracking the outbreak from China on outwards until it was really radiating outwards. The hot spots, I'd never heard the word hot spots as much as I did during the days of the pandemic. To the point where the World Health Organization declared a global pandemic, the first in multiple decades. And then, of course, for our purposes tonight, we're going to be focusing a lot on the shift to online school and how that impacted students, right? Let's just spend a couple of minutes going through, the basics of a timeline here. And it's kind of dizzying, kind of the speed at which everything happened, right? So here we were in December 2019, where SARS-CoV type 2 was, reported in China. By January, it was developing to an epidemic spreading across the world. Just, weeks later, it was declared a global pandemic. Nearly 15 million deaths associated with the pandemic in 2020 and 21. Almost over 7.5 million cases and nearly 7 million deaths by the end of 23. And of course, as we all know and can attest, this resulted in significant restrictions and changes on daily life, triggering global economic crisis as well. Here in Oregon, how did that look? Well, if you recall, at the end of February, that was when the first case of COVID-19 was reported in Oregon. Shortly thereafter, a state of emergency was declared. A week after that, the governor closed public schools. Remember, this was the spring break that never ended, right? Thought that, it'll just be a week or 2 weeks or whatever, and then extended on with COVID spreading throughout the summer. Then schools primarily operating remotely the following school year. By that spring, the governor ordered that the schools were to resume providing in-person instruction that later that spring, and with the expectation of in-person school for that following school year, which in most cases happened, right? Although, as we know, not all students ever really re-engaged in school fully. What we know about findings and impacts is that it really did have a pretty huge impact on school enrollment. So in the US, over 1 million kids failed to enroll in fall of 2020. We started to see more absenteeism, behavior problems at school. The vast majority of US schools reported that there was a negative impact on kids' behavior, their emotional well-being, and both student and teacher absenteeism was a challenge and concern. So, by necessity, and this, it's easy to look back and find fault, but by necessity, to promote safety and prevent the spread of the virus, ed tech, right? Educational technology was really emphasized, but unfortunately, as we look back, we realize this contributed to significant inequalities around the world and in the US as well. So for example, nearly 500 million, lacked internet connections at home. So that's going to be a pretty major impediment to participating in remote learning, right? Here in the US, a third of students had inadequate internet connections or hardware, and that got in the way of education, right? So we saw this theme of disparity in the impact. They were unevenly distributed impacts around this. A hallmark of youth, I'd say people in general, but especially younger people, is that there is adaptability. There can be resilience. However, again, it's not evenly distributed, so that folks with pre-existing challenges, for example, special educational needs, neurodevelopmental differences, or with parents who are already stressed and distressed, tend to have more difficulties. Unfortunately, suicide deaths did increase above and beyond what would typically be seen. And again, I don't need to tell you this, there were massive changes to our daily routines, resulting in isolation and loneliness, as our group has already identified. When I say existential impacts, What I mean here is sort of coming to terms with the realities of life, or you could call them the harsh realities of life. For example, when our kids are little, fortunately, they're not necessarily that focused on the fact that, boy, well, one day, bad things might happen. One day I'm going to lose people. But for many families, they had personal experiences of loss. And even if there weren't personal impacts of loss, there was the awareness of how scary or risky things could be. And we were still really learning a lot. We had so many questions about what exactly is this disease. Remember all the months and extended time before there was a vaccine or any effective treatments, right? So shaking the basic trust that the world is essentially a safe place was an impact on many folks. Not surprisingly, positive social relationships were found to be a protective factor, and so that was helpful. In general, what we found is that mental health problems were related both to how intense the virus was in any particular community at any particular time, but as well, it correlated with how severe the extent of protection measures like lockdown, masking, distancing, things like that. And so we have this kind of double whammy that both the intensity and the direct impact of the pandemic had negative effects on mental health, but also the necessary measures that were taken to keep folks safe. In general, a theme that emerges is that for older kids, teenagers, adolescents, they tend to have a harder time, perhaps because of how intensely social teenagers are and how that really impacted their social opportunities and added to loneliness. Not in any way to diminish those exact same impacts for younger kids, but just kind of comparing younger to olders, that's a theme that emerges in the research. The recovery from and the reentry back into school wasn't necessarily smooth either, right? So a study in England found that there were even more problems as kids readjusted and re-entered school. And so, you might take a moment and think about in your own personal experience, does that track? Did your kids in some ways have a struggle when they had to finally go back after, well, for some kids, it was their first time ever actually being physically in a classroom, right? Anytime there's a major shift in daily functioning, even when it's entering into something that's positive, like going back to school, that can be stressful and challenging. How about here at home in Oregon? Saw the same kinds of enrollment drops that were described nationwide. In terms of gains, recovery following COVID-19, unfortunately, Oregon lags behind. Elementary and middle students are still, as of the latest research, still behind, about 2/3 behind in reading, about 3/4 behind in math. And this is actually 2 or 3 times greater than the gap found by students nationwide. Why might that be? I don't think people know exactly. One theory is that because in Oregon, individual school districts were given so much freedom and decision-making autonomy to decide how to spend federal recovery money that there wasn't necessarily uniformly guided by research or best practices. I also have to just comment, like, well, what's the best practice for rehabilitating students' education in a pandemic? I don't think we have a deep research base to guide that. So in many cases, schools were just doing the best they could, but unfortunately, that did lead to a lot of disparities, and appear to still be feeling the effects of that. I'd be curious if folks would feel comfortable or would want to put out there anything that you kind of identify as a specific impact, maybe specifically in relation to school, but not necessarily. But yeah, anything other people want to add at this point in the presentation about ways that you or your kid were directly impacted. We got at that a little bit at the start, but it's been another opportunity. Let's keep rolling, but keep in mind that all of us, I think, have been touched in different ways, and of course, we're going to be turning our attention soon to what can we do? What's helpful at this point in time, given that we can't undo the past, right? I want to frame this as we move forward by thinking about three basic assumptions I bring to my work with kids, and I think many providers do. The first one, I hope, is not controversial, and I won't have to work too hard to convince you, but I want to emphasize this. Point number one is that parent well-being is critical and is the underpinning, really the foundation for our kids' well-being and mental health. We'll say more about that, but that's the first point. Second point, as parents, we're really sort of struggling to balance a couple of very important but somewhat opposing impulses. One is our need and kind of our mandate to protect our kids from harm, to protect our kids from bad things, right? And yet, on the other hand, we have to support their independence, right? We have to support them becoming confident and independent people who can go out and function in the world. And at times, those things sort of seem to pull us in two opposite directions. And I'm going to offer some tools or some approaches for how to think about those and balance those, especially kind of in light of what we've been talking about so far tonight. And then finally, again, I don't think any of these are controversial, but I want to emphasize this idea about parenting and community, whatever that means to you, right? But having a community and social support outside of just the immediate family, we have really good reason to think is critical, and we think it's directly related to youth mental health and well-being. Okay. So these are not, of course, an all-inclusive list of capacities or needs for youth, but I wanted to call these out because I think these are among the most important. Regulating, tolerating, solving. Talking about regulating emotions is a critical task and capacity that kids need to develop. By regulating emotion, what I mean by that is helping kids be able to talk about, understand, and manage their responses to the feelings that they experience. Tolerating distress. So distress, I want to define this a little bit broadly. Distress is an unpleasant state, an unpleasant feeling, and this could be something as just ordinary as boredom. That can be very distressing for kids and for adults. Tolerating the distress of having a challenge that they're not sure how to respond to, right? And then finally, tolerating the distress of feeling worried or anxious or worried about things. Yeah. And then finally, solving problems. And in my experience, I have to say, I think this is where a lot of us as parents tend to focus, right? We want to help our kids be problem solvers. We view ourselves as adults as problem solvers, and that's certainly not a bad thing. But I just want to offer that it's one of the capacities, one of the core needs that kids have, but not the only one. But in terms of solving problems, they could be things as simple as how do I get myself a snack? How do I get my schoolwork into my backpack? How do I respond when a friend has been mean or has excluded me? So there's a range of areas in which kids have to be able to solve problems. I'd be curious if folks have ideas about other kind of core needs or core things that kids have to learn how to do. What do folks think? I'm sure I didn't catch them all here.
One of the things that I think was the hardest part was he was starting first grade, my stepson, like the amount of homework and work they did in their Zoom class, and then the amount of homework they had to do outside of class to then turn in later was way more than I remember doing as a youth myself. And then the amount of extra effort us parents had to put in because we were then staying at home doing the work, dealing with my stepson's finally got diagnosed with ADHD a year and a half ago, but it's like all of those symptoms were manifesting. We were having to deal with that while boredom on the Zoom classes. So there were so many components that were coming in. So I really felt those we're creating a layering effect both on the kiddo and then also on the parents, having to try to figure out how to navigate all of the extra workload.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Great points. And that you just hit on a bunch of really important things. A couple of things I want to call out. I mean, one is that we went from being like just parents to also being kind of like auxiliary teachers in some regards, right? Which, maybe there's some positive about that, but I think was really challenging, especially if you're trying to manage your own work or just your own life in addition, right? Yeah, the extra time and burden that required, I think, was significant. Another point you raised is interesting, that a number of kids I know, it was sort of for the first time that their attention problems really came to the fore. I mean, I have to say, here you are, you're sitting on a Zoom with me. Like, it's hard to pay attention, right, for a sustained period of time, and kids are doing this for hours a day. But in some cases, it sort of made more apparent to families about how much attention was a core challenge the kids were facing, and that did lead in a number of cases to, oh, actually, this kid actually does have ADHD. We wouldn't have identified it otherwise. Yeah, so I think there are a lot of ways that I think that that kind of shifted roles around and brought new things to light. Thanks for that. Okay, other thoughts before we move on? Okay, all right, we'll definitely have more time for questions as we go. Okay, I want to walk us through some strategies, maybe their skills, maybe their approaches or mindsets. But the first one I want to begin with is prioritizing our own well-being. So I want to offer this idea that self-care, it's not a luxury. It's actually something that's just a necessity, right? Easier said than done, of course. But I say this for a couple of reasons. I mean, one is that we're really modeling for our kids, and we're teaching them the kinds of adults we hope that they will be one day. And so we know there's sacrifice as parents, and we know that there are moments where our needs do need to sort of go second to meeting the kids' needs. But on the other hand, if that's repeatedly what we're modeling, I think we're also teaching them to negate their own needs in some ways. So in terms of domains of self-care, ones I've identified are physical, social, emotional. I'm sure there are others too. But this is one that I think is really, if we learn one thing from the pandemic, I think it's that we can't really be the best parents we're capable of being if we're not filling our own cup first and really taking time to do what we need to do to be healthy. Right? Okay, strategy 2. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with this idea of emotion coaching. It's something that psychologist John Gottman writes about in his book, The Heart of Parenting. If you're interested, as we talk about this and learning more, you can check out his book. It's called The Heart of Parenting, Raising an Emotionally Intelligent Child. There's also an online course with the same title. So what do we mean by emotion coaching? It's actually fairly straightforward, and you may be doing it already, but I really like the structure and framing of this. The goal of this is to try to balance focusing on the emotion, which many of us are pretty good about doing, right? Validating emotions, noticing emotions. So balancing that versus jumping to problem solving. So in my experience with parents, we sometimes get stuck in sort of one domain or the other. We tend to, in general, we tend to be like really good at the emotion part or really focused on the problem solving part, but trying to find that balancing point is pretty important. It also kind of conceptualizes that our role can be more one of a coach or an advisor to our kid versus primarily as the person who's tasked with fixing and solving everything. This is going to vary by developmental stage, right? You're not going to have the same approach with your 8th grader that you are with your kindergartner. Obviously, the younger children are going to require more of a hands-on, involved approach. But I want to argue that even with someone who's as young as 5, we want to help them as much as possible figure out how they can be an independent agent and help resolve and address their own needs. So there's basically 4 steps in emotion coaching. We begin with noticing and labeling what we see. So it might be something as simple as, let's say our kids had a conflict with a friend and they come home and they're upset about it. So noticing and labeling it might sound like, I can tell you're really upset by what your friend did. That's really frustrating, isn't it? Right. So just as simple that noticing and labeling, going back to that core skill of helping kids process emotions, right? We help them process emotions when we give them labels for it and help them get good at labeling their emotions. The next step of validating is essentially letting them know that it makes sense that they would feel the way they feel. We're not necessarily trying to talk them out of the way they feel, even though we wish we could make them not feel that way. We're not dismissing it, but we're also trying not to overindulge it. Yeah, like, yeah, that kid's a terrible kid. You should dump that friend, right? We're basically saying, I know it must really be upsetting when your friend hurts your feelings, or that's really disappointing. That makes sense why you would be so upset. So the validation step is basically letting your kid know you understand and accept their feeling, even though maybe you're not necessarily agreeing with the feeling, you're just letting them know it makes sense. The next step is supporting and identifying options. And this might be something along the lines of asking your kid, what do you think you might want to do about it? Or what do you think you can do about it? Or have you thought about some things you can do now, right? So we don't charge in by telling them what to do. And then when appropriate, and maybe it isn't always needed, but is there some need for an action? So maybe you've helped them identify what they're considering and maybe brainstorming options. And next as well, when do you think you might do that? Do you think you need any help with that? What might make that hard? What will you do if they, say they don't want to talk to you, right? And it might be appropriate to follow up with them after they've, executed their plan. So I think we can adapt these steps across developmental levels, but if you can understand the basic notion here is we're not trying to take over the emotion for the kid, nor take responsibility for solving all the problems they're experiencing, but we're kind of being there to guide the process. So again, really good stuff in the book, and I recommend considering checking that out. Let's move on to another strategy, strategy 3. This is a little bit related. This is watching for over-accommodation. I'm not sure if folks are familiar with Ellie Leibowitz's book, Breaking Free of Child Anxiety and OCD. Highly, highly recommend it. Even if your child has not been identified or diagnosed with anxiety or OCD. But what this approach is, it's called SPACE, Supportive Parenting for Anxious Childhood Emotions. Here at Children's Program, we typically are running a couple of rounds of this per year, one for younger age kids and one for middle school kids that I help run. And it's basically a structured approach that's aimed at parents. So it's not really offered for the children themselves, but it's for parents to work on ways to empower and support kids who might be struggling with worries. A key part of the SPACE program is talking about accommodation. And so what is accommodation? So we're going to illustrate it this way. It usually works as a cycle. So if we start up here, we look at, say it's a school morning. It's really time to get out the door. And Adam says, I can't go downstairs to get my backpack. I'm too scared. And so the clock is ticking. It's time to go. And so parents say, fine, I'll go with you. They go down with Adam. And what the result is Adam gets his backpack, gets to school on time. So that sounds like a pretty good outcome, right? What this does, however, is it ends up reinforcing this idea for Adam that really the only way I can get things from another room is if my parents come with me, right? And so essentially this seems to kind of work, at least for the moment. And with the result of that is that parents continue to accommodate, right? To participate and sort of get him off the hook of having to face something so uncomfortable as going by himself. And understandably, this isn't weird. Adam continues to avoid going by himself to get his backpack, right? And the details may vary in your family, but in virtually every family, we have our own way of doing this, right? There's some accommodation cycle. So basically, now in this slide here, they're talking about distress related to an anxiety disorder, but I just want to emphasize it does not need to be a disorder. It's just distress related to this pattern or to this anxiety, right? So distress leads to the family accommodating, and that results in a short-term reduction in distress. That's the key. It's short-term, but that results in continued dependence on the parents for regulating the anxiety or worries, and then the symptoms are maintained, and we kind of go around and around and around. Yeah, makes sense to people so far? Okay. I want to emphasize that accommodations are not bad. Good parents accommodate. We don't want to see our children suffer, especially needlessly. Like, what's the point of that, right? And many times by accommodating or stepping in and sort of, helping our kids out of a tough situation, it does solve the problem. What we're referring to here, though, as accommodation is that if this becomes a rigid cycle and kind of takes on a life of its own, that's where we really get into difficulty. So in the SPACE program, the so-called mac and cheese statement is kind of the core way that we express support. It's an alternative to accommodation. And remember, I said earlier, we have these two opposing forces wanting to protect our kids and wanting them to be independent and dealing with stuff. And so the mac and cheese supportive statement tries to balance this. So what it does is it both accepts or legitimizes a child's fears, and it expresses the belief that they can handle a little bit more anxiety. So the mac and cheese, the mac is the acceptance of the emotion. The cheese is the confidence they can handle it. And that's what really equals support. So this might sound like, we know you get scared when we don't come with you to get things from your room, but we're sure you'll be okay. Okay. When we teach parents this skill, for many people, it's kind of enlightening, and they come back and report like, wow, that really worked. We're actually, just doing that alone can result in improvements in kids' anxiety management. It's, more complicated than just that, but I definitely encourage you guys to try to channel this, use this approach, and maybe even start trying it out. To me, it's a very honest approach too, right? We're not asking the kid to not feel different. We're not asking them to not feel something. We're not telling them they have to feel differently. We're not even telling them to do anything differently, right? There's no demand in this statement, if you notice this, right? We're not telling our kid to do anything, because if you think about it, when we tell our kids to do something, we're potentially setting up a power struggle, because they're free to disobey or refuse or dig in. And here we're not really expecting that. We're just saying, makes sense, you're scared, we get it. We know you can handle this. We're confident in you.
So Alan, can I ask a quick question?
Absolutely.
So in a case where, say, a kid is having trouble going to sleep at night or sleeping in their own room without the parents sitting in there, and their fear that they've named is they're afraid someone will break in the middle of the night and cause some kind of harm. So could you walk us through this with that kind of fear? Because as a parent, I think a lot of us would tend to want to say, well, that's not going to happen. You're safe. You're
Sure.
like, name that as maybe something that's very highly unlikely to happen. But so what would you do differently?
You bet.
Using this strategy?
It's a great question, Rebecca. So the first thing I'd say is that this doesn't have to operate just like in place of that kind of reassurance. I think that kind of reassurance, I think that's fair. So you might, spend time on saying, I get that that's a scary thought. That's why we have locks on our doors and our windows, and mom and I or dad and I, we always make sure that everything's locked up and, we're okay. But let's say that it goes beyond sort of that need for reassurance, and it's every night the child insists that you spend 30 minutes checking and rechecking and triple checking the locks, and insists that they go with you and they inspect all the locks on the doors. At that point, we'd say, okay, now it seems like it's starting to get a little bit like outsized. And if that's just not working for the family system, right? If it's like that's taking up too much time or having too much of an impact, that might be where you as a parent say, I can't keep doing this. We need to sort of disengage from that. So what we might say is, we know it's really scary, and you have all those fears that bother you, but we know you can handle those worries, right? We're not telling them not to worry, and we're not telling them that they're crazy to worry, but we're just saying that it's okay to be worried. The worry is not going to harm you. It's unpleasant, but you're going to be able to get through that worry. So in a sense, this kind of mac and cheese statement doesn't necessarily try just to reassure them and get them not to worry. It's basically saying it makes sense that you would be worried, but it assumes you've already addressed the worry in some other way, right? Yeah. So this wouldn't or doesn't have to be done in isolation without some degree of reassurance. This is probably more appropriate when you've already done that and it just doesn't work.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah.
And we have a couple comments in the chat regarding this scenario. My
Yeah.
son, almost 11, hasn't wanted to sleep in his own room ever since I was in a serious car accident last year. Obviously a fear issue. Is there a similar strategy I could use for that?
Yeah. I mean, sure. I think so. I mean, I think, like I just said to Rebecca, this idea of a supportive statement about acceptance of the emotion and confidence they can handle that emotion doesn't have to, or maybe even shouldn't operate all by itself. So, I might want to help that child talk about, well, what specifically are you worried about? Can they put it into words? Maybe they can't, but if they can, right, we want to sort of give them some language around that. It may be that they do need to or have some lingering feelings that they should talk about related to the accident itself. Assuming you've done that and they're still just feeling worried, what we're then maybe going to want to consider is, can we have as a goal them tolerating that worry, if that makes sense? So it's not that we're going to just turn off the worry. We're going to say that it makes sense you'd be worried given what we've been through. The worry isn't needed though, and we know that you're going to be able to be okay even if you're worried.
Okay, and just a follow-up, another person said, it sounds like their child can express the fear, like I'm afraid of sleeping alone, but not the reason why. So they say, I don't know why I'm scared. So how do you deal with that? Oh, and they also just said the child is afraid of growing up and school, but can't or won't express why.
In some ways, I actually think in that kind of case, this mac and cheese statement is even more helpful, right? Because you don't have to know why, because sometimes there is no real why to anxiety, right? Because the worry chemicals in your brain are just kind of out of control, or is just something that is happening. That's sort of like a false alarm in your brain. Even though it doesn't really make logical sense. And so there's like, how do we reassure, right, if there's nothing that they can point to that they need to be reassured about? So really then the sort of the reassurance is, you are strong enough to feel these feelings and be okay, because worries can be a part of life. In fact, for most of us, sometimes we get worried. And the idea here is we're trying to help them be confident they can get up and over that hill of worry to the other side, to fall asleep, to go to school, to, manage whatever they need to manage, and that we don't judge them for it. We don't think they're dumb or silly for it or being a baby for it. And sometimes that kind of acceptance can kind of break the ice a little bit. Yeah, really great questions. And we certainly talk more about this as we go.
Thank you.
But yeah. To me, the Ellie Leibovitz, the space program, it's both practical, but it's also really compassionate. But it also affirms our belief in our kids' basics, like their strength, their ability to get through hard stuff. And I think it's a great message to send to kids. Okay. Strategy number 4, assessing and addressing educational needs. And so we've already kind of talked about this a little bit tonight. Some people have shared some ideas here. Certainly, it would not be surprising because it's, the data suggests this is true for many students in Oregon, that there may be gaps related to sort of the missed opportunities or the challenges of COVID education. So we want to identify, if there are gaps, we need to take some, steps as needed, and that's going to vary depending on your situation. Maybe an obvious statement, but absolutely work with your school team. Most educators I know are doing the work because they love kids, they want to see kids succeed, and there are some good advocates that you are likely to have access to in your kids' school. So we want to encourage you to reach out to your school team and find out how they think it's going, share concerns that you're seeing, to kind of make a good partnership with them. In some cases, we do need to formally assess, do some testing, evaluation, review what's already known. And here again, your kid's school and the teachers they've had are really invaluable in this. There's obviously outside assessment resources. Our clinic is one. There's many. We virtually always recommend you start with the school. You probably know this, but public school students are entitled to, assessment. It doesn't necessarily need testing, but special education law does indicate that if you are raising concerns, that the school team, every school should have a team that will come together and do some kind of review and help kind of assess what's going on. As considering tutoring and coaching is a really great and reasonable thing to do. This could be as informal as asking an older cousin, an aunt, an uncle, a neighbor to pitch in and offer some tutoring or academic support. It could be as formal as a paid professional tutor. And again, many schools, many teachers are great resources in recommending approaches around that. I'd be curious if anyone has had a specific, really positive experience working with your school team, anyone or the kinds of people that you found have been really helpful in collaborating on any concerns for your kid at school. Okay, this is a big one. Strategy 5, manage media and electronics. You don't have to raise your hand, but I will guess that of the folks on the Zoom tonight, at least half have some degree of frustration or concern around kids and media use, electronics use, so-called screen time challenges. Yeah, I see. See a hand up. Did you want to say something, or you're just right? It's just saying yes, me. Yeah.
Me, yes.
Me. Yeah, for sure. And also, I mean, you may have encountered, there's been a lot in the popular press recently, and even just in the last few years. But as Jonathan Haidt, the social psychologist who wrote The Anxious Generation, I think I have a number of friends who are reading that, and I'm hearing him do interviews around the ills of smartphones and social media. Definitely a lot of research. Congressional hearings with big tech companies sort of being called to task for impacts of social media on kids and mental health. Before we go too far down that path, let's just acknowledge there are benefits to gaming, to tech use, and even social media. So we I think want to be careful about becoming too reactive or fearful around this, and sort of maybe pay attention to the nuances. In many cases, it's not the gaming per se, or even the social media per se, but it's sort of the kids' relationship and the amount that they engage with this. So yeah, I just kind of encourage a thoughtful and hopefully not a reactive approach around this stuff. We do know that research is finding that there is evidence of harm caused depending upon the age of your child, the nature of the gaming or the social media that they're engaged with. And so we want to be educated and thoughtful about that as well. The idea, yeah, boundaries for sure. Yeah, and this actually, Susan, goes with this point here is that, there's legislation and there have been suits brought against big tech companies, Meta and others around, harvesting kids' data or violating privacy policies around kids, or, creating algorithms that are known to be, addictive, keeping kids connected to the tech that they're using. And so it's possible that in the coming years, we are going to see some actual changes in policies that companies use, but I think it's safe to say probably shouldn't hold our breath on that. And we don't want to wait for tech companies or governments to sort of solve these parenting problems for us. It's tricky because in some ways it makes our job as parents harder, right? When we're sort of like swimming against the current, or trying to figure, well, how do I allow my kid to use these technologies but not sort of be harmed by them? But I think boundaries and open communication around this is going to be really important. Yes, someone says, unfortunately, kids know too many ways to get around parent and school controls. Agree, right. I mean, the average kid knows a lot more about tech and ways to bypass filters or blocking software than most of us as parents. Maybe you work in tech, maybe you're especially savvy, but I'll say even for those families that I work with where the parents are quite skilled at this, kids can typically find a way around it. So if we just say, oh, we're just going to use this like filtering program, right? I mean, I'm not saying don't use those, but I'd say there's probably a need for strategies beyond just blocking, right? Just removing access. As with many things with our kids as they age, we want to stay current. And one way to do this is to really understand, be curious about, and engage with what are they doing online on their devices, on screens? When are they using it? I can't tell you how many people have a kid who charges their iPad or a phone in their room, and the assumption is, well, they know they're not supposed to get on it. Well, those are the kids that come in and they've been up till 2 or 3 or all night gaming or doing whatever, right? And so rather than saying, oh, my kid would never do that, I'd encourage us to have a little bit of a different approach and think, well, maybe my kid would do that. And so I think a great policy is just to not have the devices in the rooms at all, or only during certain times, and definitely not overnight. It's just too much of a temptation. I encourage folks whose kids are on certainly on social media, but even on video games, maybe occasionally play with them, sit with them while they play. We really want to stay as current as we can and understand what it is they like about the games, what they do, who they're chatting with, all that kind of thing. Because again, if we just sort of treat it like a boogeyman and say absolutely not, and all we do is block it, I think it keeps us a little bit more cut off and out of the loop and less able to be responsive to our kids' needs. I'm not sure if folks are familiar with Screenagers. There was a video by Delaney, a documentary movie. Delaney Rushton, a pediatrician, created this movie and has a pretty good blog where she does these Tech Talk Tuesdays posts where there are often sort of some content and then some discussion questions that would be like great to talk about with your kids over dinner. So I definitely recommend heading over to the website, maybe signing up for that newsletter. Here's sort of another take. This is kind of ironic, I recognize, a social media influencer, but an educator who goes by the name The Gamer Educator. And they have a really interesting set of takes on sort of working with versus against tech, and not treating it, again, like I said, like this evil thing that just has to be blocked at all costs. So I think that you might find some things that they say be a little bit like challenging and provocative, but I think it's really worth engaging with because initially I read some of their posts and I don't know about that. Right? Like they're saying like, hey, it's okay for them to play games every single day. Like, okay. But the more I looked into some of their perspective, that it's actually a pretty thoughtful approach to, for example, not using screen time as this primary reward because that sort of elevates it as the most important thing. So anyway, if you're on Instagram, yeah, maybe check that person out. Okay, so manage media and electronics. And then finally, last strategy, strategy 6, connect with others, which we are doing tonight, coming together as a little small community here. So definitely activating, connecting to either existing social networks, or if you're feeling isolated, or maybe there's been a change and you're not feeling as connected now, really putting energy and time into joining or creating community. This could be friends and family, might be an organization, cultural, religious, or otherwise. Volunteer work, I repeatedly advocate for families that I work with to reach out to some kind of volunteer organization. I'm not sure if folks are familiar with Hands on Greater Portland, but that's a pretty cool social searchable website that you can use filters to kind of identify what would be an appropriate volunteer activity for my kids' age. Is this maybe a one-off thing we want to do? Is this something we want to do as a recurring activity? But if you need a place to start, this is kind of a nice clearinghouse for volunteer opportunities. So offer a couple of concluding thoughts, and then we'll shift to a little bit more open discussion. We're really familiar with all the responsibilities that we have as parents, and in my experience, this can contribute to us having maybe some unrealistic or not helpful expectations about how much control we actually have, sort of almost an illusion that if we just parent well enough, right, then we're going to be able to control everything and make sure that we've guaranteed our kid, a great childhood. I absolutely don't want to undermine the reality that we have a huge responsibility, an important one, and we absolutely make a difference. But I also have to just point out that we aren't in total control. And so we have to really focus on what are those variables that we can manage, right? We can manage what we do as parents, we can manage the support we offer, but we can't manage everything that happens to our kids, even though that we wish that we could. And in my experience, I think it's enough, especially when we take this framework, that what we're really trying to do is help our kids feel supported, but also confident in their ability to increasingly manage life on their own. So by understanding our kids' needs and focusing on that zone of influence, what we can influence, we can and do have a huge impact. Okay.